So I'm going to make a stream later, which is going to be uploaded before this video with Argent. Together, we're detailing a listing of presidents, ranking of them from best to worst. And so I made my own list, and he made his own list, and we're going to come together and surprise each other with the list. I think that there's going to be some contradictions and some differing opinions there. He is Canadian, and I can only really name three or four Canadian prime ministers. Of course, Canada is basically a vassal state of the United States, so most Canadians probably know as much about American history as they do Canadian history, ironically. Plus, he has told numerous times that he kind of wishes that his country was annexed by my country. So I think he's pretty capable of discussing American history, at least on the same level that I am. But at the same time, I wanted to make my own video. I wanted that stream to come first just so it's more surprising to people, just more dramatic with the arguing. But I wanted to make my video about my own listing. I come from more of a history background than he does. He comes more from a political science background. And so I feel like my list is pretty nuanced. And the thing with everybody else, or the way that these lists have been made, because this has been a long ongoing thing within American historiography, you would think that it wouldn't mean anything, but people really like to do this. And so there's kind of been different phases in viewing American history and viewing presidential history. And so my own frame of viewing this, and you should be looking at my chart, it's 1 through 44 because you count Grover Cleveland twice, and because I'm not going to count Biden. I did put Trump, Obama, George W. Bush, and the various newer presidents on, which I think it's fair when a lot of people say it's difficult to categorize these people because their legacy has not come into effect yet. We can't view them from retrospective. And if you're looking at the orthodox lists of various historians and my list, you're going to notice some figures that were viewed pretty negatively in their time. Truman was fucking hated when he was president, but now he's usually in the top 10. Likewise, even within a pretty left-wing America, or I shouldn't say left-wing America, within a pretty wokest academic setting now, and I'm going to talk about the different cycles of how this has been viewed over time, but even with the wokest worldview that we have right now, Eisenhower's creeped into the top 10. And I think that that's been very recent. Traditionally, he was kind of viewed maybe somewhere in the middle, the upper middle, but he certainly wasn't top 10 material. So anyway, I think that my list is very different than a lot of other people's. So I put number 1, James K. Polk. It's interesting, though, because it's like, what other James Polks are relevant to history? And so many presidents, American presidents, really like to put their middle initial in or go by FDR, LBJ, or JFK. It's a very strange thing that's in American culture with presidents using their middle names when they ought not to, or not necessarily have to. But, so I put him first, and I put Jefferson too. Why did I put them, those two to me, are the best? Well, maybe the meme answer is I live in Montana, and they're responsible for America acquiring the territory of Montana. But I have a very positive view of westward expansion. As somebody who lives in Montana, somebody who's a Westerner, that makes sense in and of itself. But I feel like those two had a very grand vision for the future of what America would become and its expansion, and I feel like they're very talented statesmen regardless, especially Polk. Polk is somebody who can stand beside the great monarchs of history, I feel, and his achievements really do show his settling of the Oregon question and the war with Mexico, which is concluded in 2 years, and his conquest of one of the greatest conquests of territory in human history in terms of scale and rapidity, along with his balancing of the budget, which is going to be a meme throughout all of American history as it goes on. And then Thomas Jefferson, one of the most important founding fathers, and he purchased the Louisiana Purchase, and yeah, despite Thomas Jefferson's anti-Catholicism and bizarre views of Christianity, and my own views and his classical liberalism and anything, there's something about him which I've always liked, and so I put him number 2. Then I did put a lot of the traditionals there. George Washington, number 3, and Lincoln, number 4, and even I put FDR as my number 7. So I did pick a lot of the traditionals, and I think for rightful reasons I put them pretty high. So my list, to go through the whole entire thing: Polk, Jefferson, Washington, Lincoln, James Monroe, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Truman, Calvin Coolidge, Eisenhower, Madison, Jackson, John Tyler, Ulysses S. Grant, Andrew Johnson, which we'll get to, John Kennedy, John Adams, Chester Arthur, William McKinley, Woodrow Wilson, which is a very interesting figure in these rankings, Taft, Benjamin Harrison, Grover Cleveland, Rutherford B. Hayes, Garfield, William Harrison, Herbert Hoover, Martin Van Buren, Harding, John Quincy Adams, Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, Donald Trump. Ooh, and you're going to notice here, I put a lot of them on the bottom, and that's because of the way that I did my list. Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, Ford, Ronald Reagan, the first Bush, Nixon, the second Bush, Obama, Franklin Pierce, Lyndon B. Johnson, and then finally James Buchanan. And so at the bottom, I felt that there are 2 existential threats to the country, and maybe this is a bad list because I put it in anticipation of an existential threat of growing division in the country and probably racial division and disintegration of the United States coming in the future. And even if that doesn't happen, just the general Brazilification of the United States, the only one that really tried to stop it in any way at all is Donald Trump, and ironically to a lesser extent Bill Clinton, with stopping crime, the giant crime spike throughout the late 60s to the early 90s. A lot of legislation that Bill Clinton signed into place, and being a moderate Democrat, was able to push through and ended a lot of the crime that was plaguing the country, which Reagan and the first Bush didn't solve as much, those so-called conservatives. So I put most of the presidents after Lyndon B. Johnson at the bottom, and then I put the 2 presidents which were the most inactive in the face of the Civil War also at the bottom, because the Civil War was the greatest trial for the United States. So James Buchanan, who's usually at either the worst or the second worst, I have as the worst, I agree. And Franklin Pierce isn't far behind at the third worst. Lyndon B. Johnson is just kind of an unbelievably bad figure, the most destructive figure, right, outside of Buchanan. Because, the way that he did civil rights, whether or not that's bad or good, is with the Great Society program, where blacks are given welfare immediately as soon as the civil rights program ends, made very dependent upon the government, crime spikes uncontrollably, blacks become increasingly more criminal in proportion to whites, and this is also his fault, ever increasing waves of Latin American immigration. Even the Latin American immigrants are committing crime at less of a rate than the insane murder rate we have right now. 60% of murders are done by blacks, and they're only 12 or 13% of the population. because of the culture of dependency that developed, the skyrocketing illegitimacy and divorce rates, and just family structure disintegration under the Great Society program, which spills over throughout the United States and creates a very violent crime wave, which is coming back again with wokeism. At the same time, he opens the floodgates to unlimited immigration from the third world, and he is the most subservient to the interests of foreign nations with the USS Liberty incident, probably the greatest scandal in all of American history, where Israeli airplanes deliberately attack a U.S. Navy boat with the executive branch clearly in cahoots with the Israeli government doing a false flag attack. And the disastrous Vietnam War, a very great misadventure in foreign policy for a war that America didn't need, which cost about 60,000 lives. Truly, even if you are a black nationalist, all those other pockmarks really should push him at the bottom. Even if you are a dyed-in-the-wool leftist, the Vietnam War and the USS Liberty incident should just slam him down to the bottom. Truly abysmal. And then every president since then has largely been unwilling and unable to address these grievous mistakes, which have led to the decline of the most powerful country in the world, with only Trump haphazardly trying to stop it and failing. And so that's why I have the modern presidents, the post-LBJ presidents, at the bottom. Because they, in my point of view, most of them are just as guilty as those pre-Civil War presidents with trying to stop the problem. I understand that perhaps Polk fed into the problem with the Civil War by the expansion westward, but also he's God tier, so shut up. Anyway, talking about how these have been ranked throughout history, the general ranking throughout history has gone through several cycles. So the earliest lists you're going to get have a very moralistic bent. And so corruption within the presidency is going to push the corrupt presidents towards the bottom. And so there is some kind of acknowledgement in the disastrous policies that led to the Civil War or in action to the Civil War, and that will also put Buchanan and Pierce at the bottom. But these more moralistic systems are going to put Harding and Grant for their corruption scandals at the bottom. Harding will often become one of the worst presidents, and he's kind of defined as a very short-term president who may have even committed suicide when his scandal, which defined his presidency, the Teapot Dome scandal, ended. I don't have Harding particularly high, but Harding's scandals didn't undermine the United States in the way of the pre-Civil War presidents or LBJ or these post-LBJ presidents or even John Quincy Adams, in my point of view, with the corrupt bargain deal that prevented Andrew Johnson from being number 6. So I see why that happens, and generally everybody of whatever political persuasion generally puts Buchanan and Pierce at the bottom. Pierce had a terrible life and was an alcoholic, and so moralistic people will also kind of double duty him because he's also in action before the Civil War and gets double dutied because of his own moral failings with his alcoholism. And I have him at the bottom too. So next up, the academia becomes more and more socialistic, and so the presidents, which were very active and tried to push social reform, are going to fly up to the top, and there's kind of this weird thing with it where the pro-white presidents that are pro-social reform and are pushing back, say, black equality in their eyes, or indifferent to black equality, or pro-segregationists, they're going to fly up anyway because of their, left-wing or populist views. So you're going to get Jackson and Woodrow Wilson fly up to the top, but a lot of like the presidents that push forward were anti-immigrate or anti-segregation, I should say. They're also going to push to the top, and so this was until fairly recent. This was the point of view where you see all these, you know, more socialistic, more interventionist presidents fly up to the top. FDR is going to knock out Washington, possibly even knocking out Abraham Lincoln in being number 1 or number 2. And Woodrow Wilson's going to fly up to the top. Jackson flies up to the top. And the more interventionist, economically interventionist presidents fly to the top. And the Gilded Age presidents sink to the bottom. And finally, you get to the modern academia, which is, wokist. So all these presidents, all these earlier presidents, which were highly viewed, that were flying to the top before because of their social interventions, now they go rock bottom, right? Woodrow Wilson, I have him in the middle, a very difficult person to rate because he didn't undermine the country. So I put a lot of people that hurt the country to the bottom. But Woodrow Wilson, personally, a Southern aristocrat, doesn't like black people, so he gets sunk to the bottom. At the same time, right-wing people don't like him because of the progressive income tax and World War One for both sides, is a minority on both of them, so he sinks to the bottom, and now a lot of academics are trying to make Woodrow Wilson into one of the worst presidents. So if you go online, and I've been watching some of these videos on the big history tubers, they have vehement hatred of Wilson. And same thing with Jackson, just this vehement hatred of Jackson. And I think Jackson is kind of pushed forward higher than he ought to be by the more moralistic or traditional stuff, because Jackson, his banking policies, I believe in Hamilton's banking policies, and he really undermined that, and Van Buren then gets stuck with the economic depression he created through his crazy banking policies. He's just kind of a general demagogue. But Jackson also prevented secession of South Carolina through pretty swift action. But because Jackson's a slave owner who did the deportation of the tribes east of the Mississippi River in the so-called Trail of Tears, it has been named, where they were deported to Oklahoma, he goes at the bottom now, right? And one of the presidents which is persistently at the bottom, for moralistic reasons to a certain extent because of his difficult personality, and now because of more wokish reasons, racial affirmative action is placing a lot of people to the top now, and pushing other traditional beloved presidents to the bottom. But now Johnson is usually in the moralistic system, in the socialistic framework, and in the Civil War type framework of who's responsible for the Civil War. In every framework, Andrew Johnson is always at the bottom. But I put him as 15, and while I acknowledge that his presidency was a failure, I think that his actions of leniency prevented a guerrilla war. In effect, the Redeemers, of course, the most famous Redeemer society being the KKK, that could have boiled over into an outright, second Civil War, a guerrilla war. But it didn't. And I think that Andrew Johnson's leniency was a very good and effective thing to prevent that. Now, I find it very difficult to put him in the top 10 because he was such a dramatic failure as a president. He was one of the least capable presidents in controlling the Oval Office and controlling the executive branch. Humiliated, his powers are taken away by the Congress against the Constitution. I'm forgetting what the bill was called. And he won in his impeachment trial by a single vote. Very, very humiliating, and his stubbornness and his inability to work with people put him down in the moralistic thing. But his prevention of the radical Republicans from punishing the South even more I think he should be pushed up higher because of that. I think that he prevented a second civil war. He prevented some kind of guerrilla action, the Redeemers going out of control. And so I push him into the middle. Another interesting figure is that the Grant was viewed very negatively. I have him at 14. And so people have been pushing him up because, he supported the Reconstruction. He supported the economic stabilization and the rebuilding of the United States after the Civil War. And yeah, he's defined by scandals in the moral framework model, but, was he personally responsible for those scandals in the way that Harding or LBJ were? He's more responsible in the way of Reagan would be with like an Iran-Contra scandal. So I do agree with his rehabilitation. There's also, it exists. It's definitely not the majority. There is a libertarian element which exists in academia, which much more than maybe like a baseline dumb burger tard American conservatism, American patriotism exists. So this like libertarian bent, they'll try to rehabilitate, ironically, like Martin Van Buren, or definitely Calvin Coolidge. And so now Calvin Coolidge within conservative circles is kind of, I don't know, maybe conservative isn't the right wing to the description, but maybe just general right wing circles, is had this rehabilitation, and so I put him into the top 10 next to Eisenhower. I think Calvin Coolidge is a peacetime president, sitting over the top of prosperity. I think he's slightly better than Eisenhower. He pushed a clampdown on immigration. I put Chester Arthur actually pretty high up over a lot of other people because he signed the Chinese Exclusion Act. So I have bias against immigration, and I have bias for westward expansion, which has definitely altered my list. It makes it a lot more distinct than other people's lists. But I don't fully agree with the libertarian model either. I don't think that FDR is some kind of antichrist. I don't add any moralistic framework into economic interventionism unless if it greatly undermines the country. I think that welfare programs are not intrinsically immoral. So I don't really have any kind of principled opposition to economic interventionism or social welfare programs in the way that a libertarian would. And so a libertarian would make, FDR into some kind of antichrist. My point of view of that kind of thing is it's not indefinitely economically sustainable. And so it's not immoral, but it can't be sustained indefinitely. And of course, the United States has fallen into a tremendous debt trap, which it seems almost impossible that it could recover. Certainly, it's impossible within a democratic framework. Had somebody like Ron Paul actually been elected, and we're going to see what happens in Argentina. How is he going to keep power and not become some kind of truncated failure as president, like Johnson, or Andrew Johnson, that is, or John Quincy Adams, or Trump? How is he actually going to abolish tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of federal jobs without becoming unpopular? And even if that is, in the long term, the right economic decision to make, and it would lead to the stabilization of the U.S. government, you have to bite down on the bitter poison, the bitter pill, the bitter medicine, and have the depression before there'd be a recovery. And, congressmen are elected every 2 years, and presidents serve 4 years, and then can only serve a maximum of 8 years. You really have to be some kind of dictator or monarch to get rid of a social welfare net or any kind of social welfare programs. It's impossible, I would say, under a democracy, or near impossible. We'll see what happens here in Argentina, but I don't think it's going to be too successful. And then there's another alternative framework, and that is the Southern framework. I did not include Jefferson Davis in my list, and ironically, of course, I didn't even mention, nobody ever includes the Articles of Confederation presidents, of course, but I didn't put Jefferson Davis, obviously, and the Confederacy on there, and I put Abe Lincoln pretty high. Because in my mind, the United States being unified is better than the United States being divided. Now, did the Civil War have to happen? No. But by the time that Lincoln had become president, I know his very election contributed to it, but the situation deteriorated so much that I don't think he is responsible for the Civil War. And that despite the suffering that the South incurred under Lincoln, in the history of civil wars, in the history of put downs of rebellions, the North's conquest and occupation of the South was very, very, very lenient. And in fact, the entire wokest framework of ranking presidents and wokest historiography is really dedicated to how terrible that was, that it was so lenient. The Southerners should have been wiped off the face of the earth and punished, and black people should have been made into aristocracy under the radical Republicans and all kinds of crazy shit, right? So in my mind, Lincoln deserves his spot in the top 5 for the quality of his leadership. I also probably bumped James Monroe pretty high up from, middle or upper middle, that pretty much everybody will put him in. And I think that just like Jefferson and just like Polk, he had a very great vision of America as a great power. And he also really unified the nation after the War of 1812. And I just said Madison on accident. So James Madison, the most difficult president, I think, to rank, because you're not ranking these people off of their influence outside of the office. You're ranking them per their presidency itself. So he leads America through its second greatest struggle, which is very seldom talked about. Its near conquest by Britain in the War of 1812, and the war ends up being a stalemate, but he supported the invasion of Canada that led to the war. So he caused the problem that he fixed. So yeah, he led America through its second greatest trial, but he contributed to the trial. He was a primary cause in the trial. So I want to put him high up, and because of his profound influence upon the framing of the federal government and the Constitution, his outsized influence on the country, you want to push him up, but his presidency itself wouldn't fall within the truly great. And then I put, a lot of the traditional stalwarts there: Theodore Roosevelt, Washington, obviously, and Truman and Eisenhower. And then I just kind of put everybody in the middle. I have a pretty neutral point of view on the whole Gilded Age thing. Then I put people that are defined by economic recession, like Hoover and Van Buren, lower than kind of like, I use Harrison and Garfield as some kind of placeholder, as like the medium. They do nothing wrong because they're in the presidency for a month or a few months in the case of Garfield, and so they do nothing right as well. So I just put them in the middle, and then people that did worse contributed negatively. So Van Buren and Hoover, defined by economic recession. Hardin, defined by corruption. John Quincy Adams, defined by the most scandalous election in American history. And then I put the Civil War, pre-Civil War presidents that are unable to stop it. And then I put post-LBJ presidents that are unable to prevent the decline of the United States, get put at the bottom with those pre-Civil War presidents. And I talked about pretty much everybody else, the Gilded Age people, the pre-progressive era people. I didn't touch on some kind of like middle upper tier people. I put John Tyler pretty high because I'm pro-westward expansion for his annexation of Texas. And, I find John F. Kennedy and John Adams pretty difficult to rate because both their presidencies are defined by trying to avoid a cataclysmic war. But I don't know if they necessarily contributed that much either. Of course, with Adams trying to prevent a war of France, the quasi-war, he clamps down on numerous civil liberties and the Alien and Sedition Acts. And then John F. Kennedy, like Madison, the invasion of the Bay of Pigs, that whole fiasco leads into the Cuban Missile Crisis. So just like the War of 1812, John F. Kennedy is responsible for his greatness and what he fixed. Talked about Chester Arthur. I kind of like think about him as similar to Coolidge, in that he was one of the better Gilded Age presidents. He was trying to prevent corruption, but he's not trying to be that actively interventionist. But he also starts the clamp down on immigration. So because I'm or as I should say, pro-nativist, anti-immigrationist, I've put Chester Arthur ahead of most of the other Gilded Age presidents. McKinley, he's there in the Gilded Age presidents. He did a war that ought not have happened. The Spanish-American War, Woodrow Wilson did a war that ought not have happened, but I'm not some kind of like zealously anti-intervention in this because what's important to me is, are you doing something that's actively detrimental for the country or actively positive for the country? And so World War I and the Spanish-American War, they don't necessarily seem to be actively positive or actively negative, while the contribution to the general decline that's happened after LBJ and was happening throughout most other Western countries, and the pre-Civil War presidents, they are actively hurting the country. And Woodrow Wilson, while there's all this vehement hate, I don't know how much he actively hurt the country in the way that bottom third does. So I just smacked him right in the middle. Maybe I didn't do the best job here. I just generally... The Gilded Age presidents, and by here I mean the Gilded Age, the Progressive Era, that was an era of American history where the presidency was particularly weak. Also, the pre-Civil War era was another era where the presidency was particularly weak. And so you see a lot of one-term presidents during a weak presidency era, and that's where Congress and the Senate become very powerful. And they tend to be, the House of Representatives, the head of the House of Representatives will become, the paramount leader of the United States often. In that kind of era, and so it becomes kind of harder to do history of those eras, and the Gilded Age is just more of a difficult era to do history, and so we don't have that much writing about that the popular public gets to see. It's just becomes one of those forgotten eras. We kind of just think about the first 7 or so presidents, right up to Jackson, and then our interest and our understanding of it all dies down. Then we get into Lincoln and the Reconstruction era, and then people know those presidents, and then the Gilded Age, it goes down until you get to World War I with Woodrow Wilson. And so I just kind of bunch them in the middle there with Taft, Harrison, Cleveland, and Rutherford B. Hayes. Of course, he's black, obviously, because no white man can have a name like Rutherford. So anyway, I put Rutherford B. Hayes and Grover Cleveland lower than Harrison and Taft, which don't make that big of a mark on the presidency, because to me, those two are worse because they were involved in pretty bloody labor disputes and massacred strikers. And so I don't necessarily think that's a cool thing, but overall total for the country, they don't really push the country down that much, as of course I have the bellwether being Garfield, who was also a Gilded Age president, and Harrison, who was president for a month and then died. Then we get into actively hurt the country but didn't cause a crisis tier, so like Hoover and Van Buren are defined by economic downturns. Harding is defined by pretty salient corruption, and then John Quincy Adams is defined by the backroom deal and the cheating of Jackson out of his presidency against the popular will. It is some kind of elitist, and all his policies failed. So not particularly pro John Quincy Adams, however smart a polyglot he may have been. Then I have at the top of the bottom tier, I put both Zachary Taylor and Fillmore higher, and that's because while they ultimately failed to prevent the Civil War or creating some kind of lasting compromise with the Compromise of 1850, they were trying to stop it. And so I feel like they were trying to stop the decline more than any of the post-LBJ presidents. And this is where I put Trump as the highest of the post-LBJ presidents, because he was trying to stop it. Now, don't get me wrong, and I know that, it's hard to define it in retrospective. Trump pretty much failed in everything he tried to do. He failed trying to reform immigration. It's completely out of control under Biden, right? He failed to address the debt. He failed to address, for the most part. He did pull troops out of Afghanistan, but he didn't end the war. He pulled troops out of Syria, but there's still troops, I think, in the Kurdish regions. He did not pull back on NATO and pull back on America's overstretched empire in a pretty bad time for the country. He didn't really put his mouth there. The only thing that might stick, and of course that's not yet to see, is that he started to reverse the policies, the terrible policies, which are mostly to Nixon and Clinton, of free trade with China. That seems to be the only thing that Trump did that might stick. But again, Trump was trying to stop the bleed. And so I actually put Clinton, which might be surprising to people because Clinton's, a post-LBJ Democrat. I put him up higher because, he's defined by a lot of bad things, by some dumb interventionism, and as I said before, terrible, terrible trade policies with China. But, he clamped down on crime. He didn't address some of the real issues there, but he got a lot less lenient with criminals, and so he made America a lot more livable. So kudos to him. Puts him better to every other Republican since LBJ, other than Trump, of course. And then I have Carter. Carter's weird to me because all these people that rant and rave about how good Reagan was for stopping the Cold War, it's like every single policy that Ronald Reagan did that supposedly contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union, that was something Jimmy Carter put into place and Ronald Reagan followed. The support of the Mujahideen, Jimmy Carter. The ramping up of the U.S. military, Jimmy Carter. Doubling down on the strategic alliance to Saudi Arabia, which would help alleviate the oil problems, right? The energy issues. Jimmy Carter. So Jimmy Carter also, he led to a peace between Egypt and Israel, which made the Cold War a lot less hot. So just his whole foreign policy is everything that Ronald Reagan did, or everything that the first Bush did that was successful, goes to Jimmy Carter. Of course, Jimmy Carter did not address the problems of the Great Society and unlimited immigration. So Jimmy Carter's hard for me because I also have an environmentalist bent. He is probably the most environmentalist president since Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, that is. Nixon started the Environmental Protection Agency, but Jimmy Carter got up and said we're going to run out of fossil fuel in front of the country. And, hilariously caused him the election because it's not going to work out in a democracy, bud. But it takes some balls to do that. So Jimmy Carter is a difficult one for me because he tried to stop some of the bleeding, right, with our energy problems and our energy issues, but it doesn't go through. Like Trump tries to stop some of the bleeding and it doesn't go through. Jimmy Carter doesn't do anything to stop the crime, doesn't help the economy very well, right? On runaway inflation under Carter to stagflation and Ford. Next, let's get to Ford. Ford is interesting because he's the least capable, but he doesn't do anything positive, right? So by my metric, I have to put him in the bottom because he's not trying to stop the decline. But ironically, I could push Ford up into being the best post LBJ president because he kind of falls into that category of being president for so short a time that you could argue he goes up there with Harrison and Garfield. But I put him at the bottom because I think he didn't do as negative stuff as Reagan did, or the first Bush did, or Nixon, or the second Bush. So I put him slightly below Carter. Carter and him are about even. Then you go to Reagan, the hero of the modern Republicans, the great conservative, the great destroyer, the great missed opportunity. Right? Okay, so the stagflation ended under Reagan. Against his own will because he couldn't control the Federal Reserve. So that does not actually go to Reagan. It kind of goes to Reagan, right? But it was against his will. Reagan, of course, passed the most sweeping amnesty bill in American history, very negatively contributing to the Great Replacement. Really exaggerated his help for ending the Cold War. Everything that he did, he was following the policies of Carter, and Gorbachev seems to have single-handedly, one-sidedly been a terrible leader who made very bad decisions, and Ronald Reagan is kind of just a placeholder that I think has been pumped up. And you go to, he contributed to a mass increase because he cut back on paying taxes, but did not cut back on social welfare programs at the same time that he pushed an expansion in the military, and causes a phenomenal increase in the national debt and into the deficit. So just terrible. We'll look back at him once America has collapsed as one of the, the terrible Caesars, right? But, he is now the darling and the prime example for modern Republicans and the so-called right wing of America. And so Bush, the first Bush, worse than Reagan. Worse because of out of control interventionism, right? I guess maybe you could say it's justified. Desert Storm or Panama. But he does this massive expansion of the military under Carter and Reagan and now into the first Bush. He's trying to establish America as the global policeman, the global superpower, with little to no benefit for the United States. And this policy, which has been followed to every president since then, to a lesser extent with Trump and arguably Biden, but not on purpose because America's declining so rapidly now. But this policy just leads to wreck and ruin. America is declining and burning money trying to become a global power. Now we get into Nixon, and I had a real difficulty trying to not put Nixon at the bottom because Nixon backs up everything LBJ does, and Nixon presides over the giant increase in crime, right? Nixon establishes federal government affirmative action. Terrible. And he's not partially, he's the most responsible for the terrible trade agreements with China and throwing Taiwan under the bus. Terrible. Now, I pushed him above the second Bush and Obama, and the reason that I did that is because he tried to get America out of Vietnam. He drug his feet, didn't do it with all rapidity, but had things not gone his way, had he been able to snake more, had he not been impeached under Watergate, maybe South Vietnam could have existed today. So I think maybe a little bit I'll push him ahead of Bush 2. And Bush 2, a disaster, right? Terrible, just crazy interventionism, absurd invasion of Iraq, terrible economic policies following his dad and Reagan. What's the winning ticket for a Republican? Cut taxes and expand the government, right? Absurd degrees of trying to become the global policeman and burning through all this money. And you know what? He's supposed to be a social conservative, right? The immigration gets voiced more within the Republican Party, obviously, and he becomes one of the at least in terms of polling data, right? After 9/11, a bunch of Arab immigrants do a series of terrorist attacks which killed 3,000 Americans. a bunch of Arab immigrants do this. He was one of the most popular presidents in history. And he had the Senate and the House of Representatives. And he did not pass any anti-immigration laws at all. It could have been saved. It could have been stabilized under him. Terrible. And then we get into Obama, which is everything of Bush, but undermines the power of the U.S. military by being quite interventionist and expansionist and global policeman-y, right? He puts women into combat roles. He reshuffles the military into being very loyalist to the left in the country as opposed to being a neutral thing, which will come up in Trump, where the military actively disobeys Trump. And there's, you know, if you look deep between the lines at the time during Trump, there was a real threat that there could be something like a coup because of how loyal they are now to the Democratic Party. So the military declines, but still terrible economic policies. Everything that Bush did, but these negative things of gutting the military. And right, I don't support, you know, interventionists. I don't support the global policeman stuff. It's terrible. But at least if you're going to be a global policeman, have a fucking military which can kick ass. Don't put trannies on the front lines. That is retarded. But nope, that's what they're going to do. They're going to put the Jannies on the front lines under him and Obama. And Trump is not going to push back against it, right? So now America is really aggressive and trying to become a global policeman, but we have women in combat. Our Navy is declining rapidly because there's all these women having all these important roles in the Navy, which aren't staffed because they're pregnant, because you don't have women in the military because they are camp followers and they get pregnant, right? But also, Obama, right, he stokes racial flames. He is going to be on the side with him and Eric Holder, Attorney General, of race riots, right? He is pro anti-white race riots. And wokeism starts to get out of control. And the whole great replacement is getting worse and worse and worse. Crime starts jumping up again after Clinton's reforms. Just pretty bad. And then Trump inherited it. And it's hard to rate Trump and Obama, but I put Obama towards the bottom for pretty obvious reasons, which I just said. Bush, but worse, and causes racial havoc and undermines the country even more. So even if him and Trump are so recent, I'd put them in anyway. Obviously, I can't put Biden in because he's still president, and it hasn't ended yet. But anyway, this video is being made before my stream with Argent, and I hope you guys like it, and this is just more me one-on-one talking about my list, the decisions I made, and my comparison with other people's or the traditional academic way of rating presidents.